This is the fishing shed that my dad built. So on the bottom part he would keep the supplies, and on top they would be hanging nets. This is one of the old whitefish nets that he used to use up north. Commercial fishing was a good way to put food on the table, especially in the early years when there wasn't many jobs. Farmers and everybody weren't doing very well, but commercial fishing was actually the industry that was making money in those days. Hi, my name's GHalgren. I've lived at Victoria Beach most of my life. And in 1975, I started commercial fishing with my dad, GHalgren. In those days, my mom and dad used to tell lots of stories of living around the lake, and I'd like to share some of those stories with you. In 1927, my dad emigrated from Sweden. He was 19 years old at the time, was going to school, and he really enjoyed reading, and one of the books he read was Call of the Wild by Jack London. And he said that's what really inspired him to come to Canada. He landed in Halifax, and from there he took the train to Winnipeg, as he heard there was a large Scandinavian community there. He got a few jobs there, but it was getting hard times. This was the beginning of the Depression, and there wasn't many opportunities for jobs. But at that time, fishing was a big industry. Everybody was getting into it. In 1929, my dad got a job with the Northern Fish Company out of Selkirk. They owned the SS Kenora, the Wolverine, and Grand Rapids. Every spring, those steamers would pull a fleet of fishing boats down the Red River to Lake Winnipeg, and then they would go up to the northern tip of the lake to Warren's Landing. The journey was about 300 miles up there. It would take about 3 days on good weather to get up there. There was bunkhouses for the men to sleep in, and a big kitchen and an eating area for them. Every morning the steamers would pull the fishing boats out to the lake where they'd be fishing, and the main fish that they were catching there were whitefish. And then they would come in, and when they got back to harbor they would have to pack and gut the fish and put it on ice. 2 or 3 times a week the freighters would come up to Warren's Landing and send it back to Winnipeg. And from there they would put it on the rail and send it usually to the States, to Chicago and New York. That's where most of the fish were being sold. The main species of fish in those days was the whitefish, of course the famous Lake Winnipeg goldeye that they used to smoke, and pickerel and saugers and perch. In 1929, my dad often told this story to people. They were out fishing that day and they had a pretty good catch, and they were coming back into the harbor, and all of a sudden a northwest wind blew up, and in a matter of no time they were into these huge waves. And there was quite a few sailboats out that day, and as the sailboats went down into the trough, you couldn't see the tip of the masts, so you can imagine how large the waves were. Well, my dad was in a gas fishing boat, but there was quite a few sailboats out that day. And the sailboat was coming up behind, and it was going fairly fast, and my dad said it went into the swell, and all of a sudden it hit the bottom of the lake and capsized. As they were going by, they saw the sailboat had been overturned, and all they could see was nets and fish and debris, but no signs of the men on board. They thought about turning back, but it just was too dangerous with the wind conditions. All the fishing boats safely got into harbor that day, and when they got back, the tugboat Spears went out to see if they could find the men on the sailboat. But as they got around the corner of the harbor, it was so windy they had to turn around. So, that day, 3 men from Norway House had drowned and lost their lives. It was quite a tragedy, actually. They all had families, and I think it had a real impact on my dad, because he would always say, you have to respect this lake. It's a very dangerous way to make a living, and you have to be very careful. 1932, my dad went to Gimli, and he bought a fishing boat for $35, and then he went to a hardware store and bought some 2x4s and made his own oars. Those days, anybody could commercial fish. All you'd have to do is buy a license. It was about $15 to do that. My dad never fished in Gimli, but he heard that there was leased land in Elk Island. He actually rode over to, and that's about 22 miles that he rode over there. and set up his tent and started commercial fishing. There was a few other cabins on Elk Island at that time, and he eventually built a log home and a place where he could store his fish and pack. My mom Lena was born in Moosehorn, Manitoba. It was a small community in the Interlake. When she got older, she moved into Winnipeg, and one of her first jobs was working at the Middle Church Seniors Home. And she met a woman there, and they became friends. And her friend had married a Swedish person, and he knew my dad, so the four of them started hanging out, and eventually they got married in 1942. After they got married, my dad took my mom out to Elk Island. They were going to be living out there. And when they got there, my mom was looking around to see where the well was. She couldn't see the well. So my dad kind of chuckled and pointed to the lake, which in those days you could actually drink the water. It was safe to drink then. When my mom started living on Elk Island, she felt very isolated. There was a few other camps around, but my dad would be out fishing with his men, and my mom spent most of her time cooking for them, and also she really enjoyed knitting, so she was always knitting some mitts and socks for them. Around 1945, my mom and dad bought a fishing camp in Black River that was on the east side of Lake Winnipeg. Every fall they would go over there. My dad had bought a whitefish boat. It was about 46 feet, and he would take some of the men from this area, and they would go there and fish in the fall. They'd start in the beginning of September and fish till the end of October. And they would also buy fish from the locals that lived there. They had a packing plant and a large ice house, and Mom had a little store in there also that would sell to the people that lived there. One year when they were there was an early freeze-up. It was probably almost the end of October, and they were running out of food, and there was about 14 of them. So they decided to walk across from Black River to Victoria Beach. It was about 22, 25 miles. When they left the shore, they were checking the ice. It was about 6 to 8 inches of ice, so they thought that was pretty safe. As they got out into Traverse Bay, the current probably from the Winnipeg River was weakening the ice. And my mom said it was so thin that they had to all spread out. All 14 of them would have to walk so that they weren't walking together. And they stopped for lunch, and my brother recalls about 2 or 3 days before that he had stepped on a rusty nail. So he was on a sleigh, and my dad was pulling him along with the rest of the people. As they moved along, the sun was coming out, and my mom said the ice was actually kind of looking black, and they were having to go around detours. And as they got closer to Victoria Beach, the Hampton family that lived at the Sandy Bay area, they saw them coming, and they actually had to put planks out because the ice was so thin. So when they got onto shore, my mom always said, I was praying the whole way, and I said, thank God we made it here alive. The next day they went down to the Hamptons to look at the bay, and here it was all open, and they could all come by the dawn of May back to the beach. After living on Elk Island, my mom and dad moved to Victoria Beach, and they bought the property. Actually, it's the property that my wife Kathy and I are living on right now. And they bought 4 lots from Bill Parisian, and each lot was $100, which you think wouldn't be a lot of money, but in those days you were actually making 10 to 15 cents a pound for fish. My mom and dad built a home here, and they built a net shed where they kept all the supplies in a packing shed, and also an ice house, which every winter my dad would put ice up. My dad retired after 57 years of fishing on the lake. He loved fishing. That's what he really enjoyed doing. And when I think back, when I used to fish with my dad, we were out there, and some days we wouldn't catch that much fish, and I thought, we should really be pulling these nets up. We're not even making enough for gas money. But he just wanted to be out there. It didn't matter if he was catching fish or not. One of the other things that was good about commercial fishing we always had fish to eat. My dad loved to eat fish. He could eat it every day, but a lot of times we were eating it 3 times a week. And my mom knew every way to cook it. There was sunfish, there was pickerel cheeks, every type of fish that you can imagine we ate. My dad read the book called The Wild, and when I think about it, he really did live his dream. Jack London went up, built a log home, he had the dog sled. My dad went to Elk Island, he built his log home and had the dog sleds when he first started fishing. For him, he fulfilled his life, he was happy, and I'm glad that I was part of that life with him. In 1986, I retired, and recently we took over my parents' homestead and we tore down my mom and dad's old house and we built a new house here. But one of the things that we'd really like to do, the net shed is still standing there, and I have a lot of my dad's old jiggers and different things from fishing, which I'd really like to make a little museum. This was what they used to cut the ice in the wintertime. There was usually about 3.5, 4 feet of ice, so you can imagine how hard and labor intense this work was. This was the old scale that my dad would weigh the fish on before he would ship it to the market. I have 2 grandchildren, Liam and Isla, and I'd really like to pass that information and history on to them.
My name is RThomas. I'm from Traverse Bay, Manitoba. I lived there most all my life, except when I left to go and work, returned to Traverse Bay, and became a commercial fisherman. That's what I do today. My dad's name was John Thomas. He's the one that really taught me how to fish for a living. I got into commercial fishing more or less as a hobby, I guess, helping my uncles out, my father out when I was young, learning through them all the ropes about fishing. If it wasn't for them, I don't think I would have pursued commercial fishing. But it was in my Métis blood, like through family. We didn't depend on it, but we made a living off of it, fishing. I fish spring season, fall season, and winter season. Usually the winter season, all I do is carp fishing. In the wintertime, we drive out there with skidoos on first ice, and as the ice gets thicker, we usually use our side-by-side machines we have, and also we drive out there on trucks, vehicles, once the ice is thick enough. When the lake is froze like that, we set our nets with it's called a jigger, and it crawls underneath the ice. We pull a line through 100 yards or 85 yards, depends on the length of your nets. And then we tie the net on the other end of the line, once the line is pulled through to the jigger. And then we pull the net underneath the ice and it stays there all winter long, like long as it don't freeze onto the ice, which you've got to make sure you're in deep enough water for that purpose so that it won't freeze on. And they stay there all winter long, usually. Sometimes we have to pull up because there's not much fish in that area, so we pull up and move and do the same thing over again. Long ago they didn't take carp, but now there's a big demand for carp. The Asian markets and China wants carp, and all the carp we catch here, I think it's mostly all shipped to Europe. It's hard work. It's very hard work, like, cold, but you get used to that. The thing is, there you're your own boss. Like, you're not taking orders from anybody else. You work for yourself. You work at your own pace, and that's one of the things why I like it. My fish products like pickerel, goldeye, catfish, any kind of fish, especially the goldeye and the catfish, is smoked, and I sell that at all the farmers markets around the beach areas, like the Bonnie, Beausejour, Selkirk, Lockport. And I also sell in all the stores in the beach areas. Customers in the city, like regular customers, and which I deliver to the cities also. There's a big demand for fish, very big demand. But I see the fishery, the way it is now. I hope it doesn't come to an end, but the way things are going, I think it might come to an end, like, with the climate change and all the algae and mussels and all the stuff that's running into the lake from the cities and the farms and stuff like that. It's terrible sometimes out there in the lake. That's what I tell my grandson too. I said, I don't know, maybe it's time to start looking for another occupation besides the fishing, because he's still young yet, my grandson. And my dad fished in the wintertime, but not the way I fish now. He just more or less done it for food on the table.